Thank you, Dennis. We are delighted to present to you the first two speakers of the day. You have their bios in the pamphlet that is in front of you. Let me touch on a couple of things. One of the two speakers, he goes by the name Jorge Gomez. He is the managing member for J&A Engineering. He is a professional engineer specializing in electronic systems engineering and voice data structured cabling design. Now, I asked him to share something personal or something interesting, and he said that 17 years ago, you got laid off, right? You got laid off, and then you started this business, and he is based in Atlanta. He started this business by using one of his kids' bedrooms. And today he's got about 20 employees, very successful business. He's going to tell you a little bit more about that. The second speaker is Russell Law, also based here in Atlanta. He's a senior consultant with Gralian. He has nearly 20 years of experience leading teams, providing executive protection, security operations, code of conduct, investigations, intelligence analysis, and crisis management. Now, he is originally from East Texas, from a small town right outside of Houston. And he tells me that do not be surprised. He makes a lot of references to East Texas because I think that's where his heart still is. But we have him here in Atlanta. Please welcome the two speakers this morning, Jorge Gomez, Russell Law.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Fabian.
I'll tell you what, let me come over by you. Good morning, everyone. Hope you've had your coffee and you're ready for a great session. I'm Jorge Gomez, and from both Russ and myself, we're so pleased to be here. Thank you, Georgia Cable and Electric, for hosting us at the beautiful Georgia Aquarium. We're going to talk for about 45 minutes and then open the floor for questions. So please jot down your questions as we go along.
Better grab the speaker. That'd be
advanced slides.
Important. So, in 2013, I first met Jorge Gomez over lunch, and we were introduced by a good mutual friend in the security industry who thought that the two things that we do could be complementary and could work well together. And so we met for lunch, and I was very excited by the end of that lunch because we talked about all kinds of things security, and also because Jorge paid. So let me rewind a little bit. I'd been working for ExxonMobil for about 7 years when I found myself sitting on a tarmac in a Mercedes at midnight waiting for Rex Tillerson's plane to arrive. I had ended up there because I had gotten the opportunity earlier that year to move to London to be the security advisor for ExxonMobil UK and Ireland. And I didn't realize at the time just how influential that move was going to be to my career. Because what that did for me was it was basically like working for 12 different clients at the same time. 12 different clients with very different needs and interests when it came to security. The executives were one of my clients. Retail was one of my clients. They cared about theft. Production was one of my clients. They cared about terrorism. Retail also could put up a fight if you recommended a camera or two because it was expensive. Production didn't put up any fight if you recommended a 20-foot high security fence with intrusion detection system. So what it taught me was the necessity of bringing recommendations that support the business, and that the business was the important part to learn. As long as you had the security principles in the background, you could apply those the right way to what the business needed. George?
And then from my standpoint, I have approximately 30 years of experience. I've worked as a security contractor, as an engineer for a security manufacturer, and then also as a security consultant for multiple A&E firms. For the last 20 plus years, I've worked as a security engineer specializing in the design of security electronics projects. I'm going to share a story with you that illustrates exactly why we are here today and why the process we are about to share is so important for the long-term success of any security construction project. I was working on a greenfield pharma project years ago. We designed the security systems based on conversations from the owner, the head researcher, and the project architect. It was the early days of biometric access control, and everyone was excited about using a hands-free electronic access control solution. So after much research, we selected iris scanners and electric door hardware in each one of the labs. So if you can picture this, long corridor on a research floor, individual labs on both sides, all secured with iris scanners and electric door hardware. As it turns out, we discovered that researchers are very social animals. We were called back a few months later to talk about the installations after they were fully commissioned, and it was determined that these researchers needed to communicate within the labs to themselves and across the labs. So here we had iris scanners on all the doors ready to secure the labs. All the doors were being propped open, and just a series of prop open alarms constantly for the security staff. So we had a very expensive system that would only be used after hours. Not a good result, given the fact that not a good result, and we base this on the fact is that the head researcher, which we programmed all the requirements with, was just too far up the food chain to really understand how the researchers needed to use that individual floor. So this presentation is all about avoiding that situation, just like this. And for 7 years now, we've been working with Russ and getting much better results.
So, take you back to that lunch that George and I had together in September of 2013. And as I mentioned, I was very excited by the time we were done because we had talked about his background, his team's expertise and resources, my background, my team's expertise and resources, and we thought, hey, we've got an opportunity, just like the Reese's Peanut Butter Cup, to have something that is more than the sum of its parts. Because the idea we came up with that day was the idea of combining both our expertise from the very beginning of the vulnerability assessment process to have the security management expertise and the A&E project management expertise, the technical security expertise, and have that all the way through. So that by the time we got done, we had recommendations that had such a sound foundation and such merit that we were delivering a huge value. So when I was explaining this, I actually had this slide up on my computer last night, and my son came in and was interested because it's a Reese's Peanut Butter Cup, of course. So he asked me to explain what this means. He's 10 years old. And so I told him, I was like, well, you know, it's like you wouldn't open a jar of peanut butter and eat the whole thing and then follow it with a Hershey's bar. It just wouldn't be as good. When you put them together, they're just amazing. And that's what George and I felt like we had when we finished that conversation. And it would be less than 3 months before we'd be able to put that into practice at the headquarters campus of a Fortune 50 company. And it worked great. And since then, we've put it into practice at K through 12 schools, private schools, companies with very sophisticated security teams, companies that haven't even identified a security manager. And this process continues to show again and again that by the time we get to the end of the process, which that's kind of a misnomer too, because it's something that keeps going, as all of you probably know. By the time we get to deliver the recommendations, we have something that really fits the business. So, a note on convergence, the theme of today's summit. So, a while back, some of you might remember, it was all about physical threats to physical assets. Back in 2013, I actually wrote something on my blog 7 years ago about the convergence of physical, electronic, cybersecurity. In 7 years, a lot has changed, but a lot has stayed the same. When it comes down to it, it's all about motivation, capabilities, and protecting assets. So now you have physical threats to information assets, network threats to physical assets. You also have network threats to network assets, but that's not our expertise, so we're not going to hit on that. But as you'll see when we start going through the principles, when you apply those principles to any type of vulnerability assessment, they're going to help you out. So who here knows who this is? Anybody? No. That's a good one. Anybody? All right, this is Michael Caine. This is from the original Italian Job. Any of you who have ever seen a heist movie know that the team that's doing the heist is made up of members that have different capabilities, different expertise. You've got the computer expert who's changing all the stoplights from red to green so they can get away. You've got the expert driver. You've got the muscle who takes care of the security guards. The bad guys don't care what department you report to. They care about the thing they're motivated to get, whether that's information, whether that is to hurt somebody in your staff, to damage your reputation. They have an agenda. So my point there is the threats are going to continue to adapt. Who knows who this guy is? Has anybody seen this one? So this guy is a performance artist, and he decided it would be interesting to set 100 mobile phones to run Google Maps at the same time and roll them down the street in a little red wagon. And you know what that did? It created a virtual traffic jam. The first thing I thought of when I saw this was, oh my God, I'm glad I'm not doing executive protection right now. Because if I had an executive who had a high profile, was going to a high profile event, and say there's an activist group who's interested in damaging my reputation, they create a virtual traffic jam, my drivers aren't ready for that. So the threats are going to continue to adapt. And technology is kind of a double-edged sword. It's something that benefits both sides. The adversaries bring higher technology, the defenders up their game. So what I have a little aside here about being careful about being over-reliant upon technology, about understanding the limitations of technology as a tool. And so something that's I have a very strong opinion about are criminal background checks, for example. Raise your hand if you work for a company that uses criminal background checks to screen your employees. Just about everybody. There are huge gaps in the information that you can obtain with a criminal background check. I believe in this so much, I actually founded a second company called Forensics that provides a software that fills those gaps. But I came to this conclusion and understood this based on my background in investigations, because I've investigated a lot of employees over the years for doing stuff they weren't supposed to do, a lot of them criminal. They got fired, nobody called the cops. There's no reference on their background about what they did, who they did it to. They go to the next job, they apply, they get it. So just a little bit about the reality of physical security here in the US. So here in the US, we actually experience with physical security, we have a fairly low threat level. We don't have some of the issues that go on in some of the other parts of the world that are less stable. You don't have mass riots. You don't have political unrest every day. Most days, now you have those things sometimes, most days we go to work and we don't have to think about those things. And I'm going to do a little experiment here. I don't know how this is going to turn out. Raise your hand if your area of responsibility for your job is physical security. Okay, quite a few. Keep your hands up if you also have another role within your organization, whether it's HR, facilities, whatever. So there's quite a few, not as many as I thought. But oftentimes what happens here in the United States, a business starts, they're worried about the stuff that they have to do to run the business. Eventually they get to a spot where they say, well, gosh, we need to worry about security. And they end up going to the facilities person or to the HR person or to the IT person and saying, hey, we need you to take this too. So everybody here knows what a security vulnerability assessment is, right? If you don't, quick primer. A security vulnerability assessment is a process, not an event. You identify the threats to your assets, whether those are operations, people, information, buildings, and then you evaluate the controls you have in place to mitigate those threats, identify the gaps in those controls that let bad guys do bad stuff, identify ways you can close those gaps, make sure the way you close those gaps is not going to disrupt your business, develop a plan, and do it all again. So if you were to come to me and say, hey, Russ, I know you've done a few of these. Could you give me some advice on security vulnerability assessments? I'm not going to pull out my copy of how to do vulnerability assessments and take you through the whole book. What I am going to do is I'm going to say, okay, I've learned a few things over the years. George and I have learned a few things over the years in our projects together. And so we're going to hit the high points, and whenever you're involved in a security vulnerability assessment, it's a lot of little micro tasks and actions along the way. And those micro tasks and actions, how you handle them, can either really propel you forward or can give you big headaches. And that's what we're here to tell you about today.
So now getting to the secret sauce of our process. We believe there's 7 principles for leveling up our vulnerability assessment. The first being in-house versus outside consultants. We're going to talk about which is a scenario in which we feel works a little bit better, given the fact that we're outside consultants. Number 2, the leadership buy-in. How many of you had issues with not having leadership buy-in from the beginning? We're going to discuss steps for getting the key decision makers in the room. Number 3, stakeholder involvement. Remember the pharma story. We needed to talk with representative of the researchers. We're going to discuss getting input from all of the right people. Number 4, are you ready for the results? Sometimes the results tell us things that we don't want to know, or specifically the client doesn't want to know. And numbers 5, 6, and 7, we're going to talk about the process itself, from preparation through evaluation, finally into the implementation. From in-house versus outside consultants, from our experience, in-house subject matter experts feel it's their responsibility to come to the table with a plan. It's often the case, we meet with the main representative for a facility, they present us a plan, design around this, here are the specifications. We found that the project tends to be more successful when we start off with a vulnerability assessment, and that often requires an outside perspective. You can think of it as the old adage, not being able to see the forest for the trees.
So as George mentioned, we're outside consultants, so you probably think you know where we're going to land on this with regard to in-house subject matter experts or outside consultants. But the truth is, just like George and I can manage a project more effectively as a team approach, this has to be a team approach. You have to have inside subject matter experts who basically are your security champion within your organization. But you also need outside perspective because you can lose the forest for the trees. So one of the pros of a subject matter expert, an in-house subject matter expert, is they've got a lot of institutional knowledge. They understand how the business works, they understand what's been done in the past, what's worked, what hasn't worked, but you also have the possibility of tripping up there because there are a lot of assumptions that you make when you are part of an organization. There are things that you start to take for granted over the years, and you need an outside, unbiased perspective to help you see exactly what you need to see. Now, I actually have a story about how this went wrong. This can actually affect the big guys just as much as it can anybody else. So when I was working at ExxonMobil in the UK, I was working with the refinery in Southampton. And our very capable technical security team had decided that we were going to be pioneers. This was back several years ago. We were going to be pioneers and put in motion detecting cameras on all the jetties and all of our refineries in Europe. It worked pretty well. Again, this was pioneering. This was before the kinks had been really worked out of the system. But we discovered a big kink in Southampton. Southampton, just so you know, it's the same port where the Titanic took off. There are huge tidal swings in Southampton. And the video analytics at the time just started going crazy, showing false positives all the time. We had to brick some very expensive cameras. So, did you have something else?
No.
Oh, sorry. So there are pros and cons to both sides, but as I mentioned, the important thing is that you need to identify a security champion within your organization who's going to work with outside consultants. If you decide to do a security or vulnerability assessment, you have a new capital project coming up, you have new facilities, whatever it is, you've got to have that team effort. Next is leadership buy-in, and this one can be pretty difficult. Whenever we start a new security vulnerability assessment project, I tell my security champion, because I've now identified my security champion, I tell my security champion, I want you to invite the highest level executive you can to the kickoff meeting, which usually gets me kind of a funny look. I didn't say the highest level security executive. I said the highest level executive. I want somebody in management, the executive suite, operations to be at that kickoff meeting if you can do it. Doesn't happen every time. That's okay. They asked the question. It's been delegated down. They now know we're doing this assessment. They might not have known exactly what we were doing before. The reason for this is the recommendations that you're going to make during this assessment are going to get noticed up the line sooner or later. They're going to be expensive. They're going to be process changes. They're going to be education that you need to provide to your team and the way you handle your customers potentially. Eventually, it's going to make it up the line. Another big reason, and I've seen this go sideways before as well, is that you can do the most amazing vulnerability assessment. You covered all your bases, you've ticked all the boxes, you get to the end, and you meet with one of your executives and they say, well, this is great, but what about my parking spot? Nobody looked at my parking spot. You now have reduced the value of your entire assessment. So the leadership buy-in at the very beginning is so important to get. We're going to talk about the end of the process too. Closeout is just as important. You invite that same person to the closeout meeting so that they understand what it is you found. Notice we're building a team here. The next piece of this is stakeholder involvement. Security does not happen in a vacuum. This is a team sport. And whenever we do a kickoff meeting, we also invite people from HR, people from IT, facilities, people who manage the executive admins, anybody who owns or is part of a process that is even tangential to security. And there's a few reasons for that. One, it helps us define the scope. Scope is extremely important because scope creep can absolutely ruin an otherwise perfectly good security assessment. You're going to do building A. Well, we also have building B where that process takes place, but building B also has a parking garage and the executives sit on the 5th floor. So now we've quadrupled the size of our assessment. Hold on to that scope tightly, define it during your kickoff meeting with your stakeholders, give them the opportunity to understand your expectations and to say their piece, and to let them know that you're going to be interviewing them and their team as part of this process.
And then you remember my original pharma story. I think that was a perfect example of not really getting the correct stakeholders in the room from the very beginning. So now in our projects, we carefully identify the individuals who can help us understand business operations, since we know we need to merge them with the security priorities.
So the next thing to think about before you even start is, are you ready for the results? And you're going to identify gaps that probably should have been filled already, or somebody's going to think probably should have been filled already. You're going to identify gaps that people are afraid to tell management about because they're embarrassed or whatever. We actually encountered this on a project we worked on together here on a large corporate campus. We identified the threat that several times, on several occasions, unauthorized people had ended up on the upper floors of this office building. The security manager and I got to talking, and I said, well, you know, part of what you really need, you need all these other things. One of those things was cameras on the elevators. If you want to investigate this and find out, who's doing this, so you can, if you want to press charges, you need cameras on the elevators. We can't do that. Well, I said, why not? I said, is there a technical issue? Nope. COO thinks it's too big brother. We can't do cameras on the elevators. And so one thing you're going to encounter is that there's going to be pushback all the way down the chain to some of these recommendations. What you have to do is you have to define the way you came up with these recommendations so that you can really push up the chain the measures that you believe have merit, that you've got the backup to go to that COO and say, look, this is part of what you need to do because it's putting your people at risk. You've got to be able to do that, whether you're the outside consultant or the internal person.
And then a different example, more from the engineering side of things, is we also worked on a project together. It was a large deployment, and it was determined we wanted to roll out enterprise access control, enterprise video, as well as mass notification. So originally, the first thing we determined is we needed to really invest in good infrastructure to be able to do that. The whole project team expected that the infrastructure was going to be adequate, so we really had to get over that hurdle of that initial cost where they weren't going to see camera run, card reader run until we can get that infrastructure in place.
One other thing you need to think about in the results, or one thing that I've heard a lot from clients over the years, is that they're afraid if they uncover something in an assessment that it's going to make them more liable. Here's the news. If there's any foreseeability, even retrospectively, it doesn't matter whether you knew it or not, you're going to be liable. So you need to do the assessment. Make sure you understand what the issues are, what the gaps are. Put your plan in place to fill those gaps. As long as you have a plan in place, some of these recommendations are going to take years to fulfill. The example George gave a minute ago, the infrastructure that client put in, they still, a few years later have not taken advantage of that infrastructure to put in their mass communication system, but it's in their plan. They know it's coming. And because of the recommendations that we put together for them, they're ready for it. So before the assessment, George and I always hold a kickoff meeting with the stakeholders. And I talked about this a little bit when we talked about making sure you had the right stakeholders in the room. This is, again, where you confirm your scope and where you talk to those stakeholders about what they see as the potential threats. Now, this is going to include insider and outsider threats. And just another little aside here. The term insider threat has really become almost a cybersecurity word. But in today's business environment, an insider threat also means workplace violence. It also means bullying. It also means harassment. It's both sides of the coin. So you need to make sure that the stakeholders who are involved understand exactly what it is you're going to be looking at and set expectations. So during the assessment, one of the most sensitive pieces during the assessment are the interviews. Interviews have to be done in a very particular way, in my opinion. They cannot be an interrogation. For those of you who have done investigations in the past, I've done investigations in the past, it's not that kind of conversation. It's not adversarial. These people who you're talking to when you do the interviews, they're part of your team too. And you're there to understand their perspective on what their concerns are. And if any of you have ever done an interview like this, you know that most of the time it starts out with, well, tell me about any of your security concerns. Oh, I don't have any. Then you have to keep the conversation going. Part of the way that we handle this piece, and I actually learned to interview from a really great guy who was a former New York police detective for about 20 years. And this guy was like Houdini when it came to interviews. He never stopped smiling, but he could always get people to admit to things they did. And when you do an interview, you have to set the tone. And that tone in this situation, as I said, needs to be an open conversation. So what we do is we tell everyone we talk to, this is what we're doing. We're doing a security vulnerability assessment with your team so we can make sure that everybody here is safe and works in a secure environment. The stuff that we're going to talk about today is going to help us develop the recommendations that we're going to deliver to your management. We are not going to attribute anything you say directly to you. So you can speak freely. We're going to use what you say to put our recommendations in place, but we're not going to say, this guy told us that guy doesn't lock the door every day. That's not going to happen. Another piece is what we've found over the years to be a really key observation point, and that's the reception desk. So whenever we do a vulnerability assessment and we're doing our site tour, we actually post someone at the reception desk for a couple of hours sometimes. So here's the thing. If anyone has ever been taken out of that building in handcuffs, if anyone has ever had an angry spouse come up and start screaming, the receptionist knows about it, or whoever works at reception knows about it. The receptionist oftentimes gets the mail, gets flower deliveries, understands the visitor process. You're going to learn a whole heck of a lot from posting somebody just at that one spot because it's a funnel. Another piece is to be curious about how the business runs. And I've got one more ExxonMobil story, and then I promise I won't give you any more of those. So I was doing a site tour with the terminal manager at a terminal that stores about 25% of the jet fuel for Heathrow Airport. If this terminal goes down for any reason, Heathrow just stops. So this terminal manager was relatively new. He had been there for only a couple of weeks before I surprised him with a vulnerability assessment. And so we were walking around the site, and as we're walking around, we noticed that a door is open. And it's propped open with a rock, as they often are. And as we walked by, he said, that door's not supposed to be open. I said, what's in there? He said, the control room. Okay. So we walked in, and there was nobody there. All of the computers were sitting there running the information they needed to run the site, and there was nobody to see us walk in. So we sat down, and after about a minute, somebody walks in and kind of in a huff says, hey, who are you guys? You're not supposed to be here. And he responded perfectly saying, I'm the new terminal manager. This guy's from corporate security, and that door is supposed to be closed. And that's what I mean by be curious about how the business runs. You have to kind of get in the weeds and understand that the recommendations that you make need to support business operations. Security is there to support the business, not the other way around.
And then from our standpoint, we just worry about getting too much in the mode of being a construction engineer and not really testing and understanding the process. I think we do a disservice to our clients when we do that.
Okay, so after the assessment is done, and again, this is kind of a misnomer because when you're assessing security, you're not done. It's not a set it and forget it. This is something that you need to do either on a set frequency, whether it's annually or biannually, depending on the threat, depending on your operations, before you do capital projects, before you change operations. There's several triggers that can trigger the business to need to do this. But after the assessment's done, we've developed all of our recommendations. We bring all those stakeholders back into the room. We've interviewed many of them. We've interviewed their teams, their staff. We bring them all back, and we say, okay, here's what we came up with. Now, you can't deliver every single recommendation in that meeting. It's just not logistically possible. So what we do is we give them a top 10, kind of like we gave y'all our top 7. We say, okay, these are the top 10 recommendations that we came up with in order of priority. And oftentimes what ends up coming out of that is we talk about many of the other recommendations because they all kind of fit together and piece together in that top 10. So once our team now understands what we came up with, our leadership understands what we've been doing for the past few months, few weeks potentially, now we have to develop a plan to roll that out. And the way you roll it out is so important because if you don't do it right, you're going to have a mutiny on your hands. I can't tell you how many reasons I have come across to prop a door open. It might be ventilation. It might be smoke breaks. It might be to feed the local stray cat. But it happens. And I've had serious answers to all those when I asked, why is that door being propped open? So you got to understand the why, and you got to communicate the why if you want things to actually change, if you want it to become part of the culture. So now the work really starts.
Right, and then from our standpoint, we kick in on the construction side of things. We want to develop probable cost to support all of the recommendations that we come up with so that the client can make educated decisions. This is where leadership buy-in principle really pays off because we've had leadership involved in the process from the very beginning. They're ready to invest in security improvements that will make a difference. After approval, we develop the scope of work for construction, and then we feel like we're off and running. So We've covered end-to-end each of the 7 principles we wanted to talk about today. So let's recap, and I hope you have some questions. Talked a little bit about inside versus outside consultants. I think we covered that one pretty well. Leadership buy-in, stakeholder involvement. Are you ready for the results? Are you ready for the results is a tough one, because we often get through a design process and we recognize that, wait a minute, our infrastructure just can't handle what we really need to do. And then the process itself, preparation, evaluation, and implementation. Wanted to go ahead and open it up for any questions.
And we got some mic runners out there as well. Can I see the mic runners? Thank you, George. Thank you, Russell.
Oh, absolutely.
Questions? We've got mic runner there. Do we have one on this side of the house? Just raise your hand if you have a question that will help probe a little bit into an area that interests you. Right here in the front. Steve, I can see your name tag. Steve, thank you for your question.
You guys explain a little bit about how trends now are in corporate security and industrial security. You're looking at security leaders outside the common sphere of ex-policemen or FBI agents, and looking at business leaders with financial and management and human resource experience, because the coordination, like you said, with the business is very important to make everything work. So can you talk a little bit about that kind of transition?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a trend that's been going on for a while. I actually saw that when I was back at ExxonMobil, and I left there back in 2010. The head of corporate security was a lady who actually had come over from the IT department. And so I think that it's a very powerful way to make sure that your security leaders understand the business. I really think that the best approach is to have kind of a mix of both. To have people who do have that past law enforcement experience, might have that past military experience, who understand some really sound security principles, but you also need people who understand the business. And I'm a little bit biased on this too, because before I went in corporate security, I actually am a journalism major, if you can believe it. So it's something that I think, like any good team, like Michael Caine and his team, you have to make sure you understand where the gaps are and what kind of team you need to put together to fill those gaps.
And then from our standpoint, we're just saying IT has to be at the table, which in the olden days, it really was more of the security teams, the architects, and maybe an owner of some level. But now it's got to be IT as well. Absolutely.
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 We've got 6 more minutes. Questions? Right there. And if there's a hand, would love to give you a mic in preparation for the next question. Go ahead.
Thank you. Do you often find that after the vulnerability assessment that there has to be a capital cost or project improvement, the infrastructure of the site or whatever, or do you often find that there are just operational adjustments that can be made and there's not an investment into an access control system or an upgrade or anything like that?
I'll take that one, Russ. Yeah, and I think that a good consultant is always going to answer, it depends, because it really just depends on the actual client and what their capabilities are. But from our standpoint, is what we feel we need to do in almost all cases is develop probable costs so they can really understand what's happening. So assuming that the client really does need a significant infrastructure increase, we can put a cost on that, or we need to put a cost on that. And if their infrastructure is capable, then we bring that up as well. And frankly, if they even wanted to know what the savings they'd have associated with that. But that's why we always have that construction component in there as well.
And I'll just add on a little bit to that, onto the it depends piece, because every single one of these is completely unique by the time you get to the end of it. But in our experience, we see you're going to end up with both every time. You're going to end up with some things that it's going to take time and money to implement. You're going to end up with some process changes that might also take some time to implement. You're going to end up with a whole spectrum all the way down to, hey, that door needs to be locked today, and that's it. So it's really kind of a wide array of what we find.
We've got time for 1 or 2 more. Raise your hand. Right there in the middle.
Excellent topic. I really appreciate the opportunity that you're sharing this with the physical security community. I came out of the IT software development project management back in the day when we were just programming the gas pumps to be able to take a debit card, credit card. So I grew up in that type of industry, and when I came into physical security about 11 years ago, I noticed that there were not requirement definitions that were completed. There were no, understanding the business operation, the critical success factors of what is important, and how do we overlay technology to be able to bridge that. So I've always wanted to see this come into this industry. Where we're challenged is when you get into large corporations, this might be very common, but when you get into a smaller company, they push back and they don't want to do, plan the work the plan kind of mentality. They just want to, I just want the cameras, or I want the access control. How can you help us understand, is there a return on investment? How do you position it that this is very critical for a long-term play to secure assets and people?
I mean, the way that I usually term it as far as value goes is that it's a people first kind of thing. And you can't put a value on your people. That keeping your people safe from external threats as well as internal threats is something that's invaluable. And you're absolutely right. In my experience, I've seen the same thing. You have very sophisticated security teams in major corporations, and you have some companies that are kind of on their way up, and they haven't even identified a security manager yet. So they go to the first person they see, and they're like, "Hey, you got security now."
Yeah, and then from, I think it almost leads into my original pharma story, is that if you don't go in and put some time in vulnerability assessment and programming, you could potentially get a system that you're not even using, or that's overpriced for what the application is. So I think that every good engineer needs to go in there, and if they don't necessarily do a vulnerability assessment, they need to do some components of it to make it a much more significant programming phase.
If I could probe a little bit more, I remember, Russell, you were talking about how you get the C-level people in and you give them facts, you give them data that you've collected. This has happened, that has happened, this is the information that should compel you to action. Could each of you, without giving up names of clients, share specific examples of metrics, measures, specific data that you have selected to influence and to convince the client that they've got to do something?
So one for me was, and I promised I wouldn't tell another ExxonMobil story, but here we are. One for me was, we had an executive who had just recently been moved up into the executive protection program. And we had a very defined executive protection program. We had like 25 people who had some sort of security measures around what it was they did. I kind of put it in terms of like airline frequent flyer miles. You've got your gold, your silver, and your platinum. This guy had just moved up to platinum. And so the conversation was around, now you've got a driver, now you've got security systems on your house, you've got all these things that we need to basically change your routine. And he didn't want any of that. He was a very humble guy, and he said, I don't need a driver. I don't need people to babysit me when I go on trips. And we had to, it's not really a metric, but it's experience, in that we had to be able to help him understand that while he was a nice guy, it wasn't for his sake that we were doing that. It was so the stock didn't tank. And so as soon as we put it in those terms, he totally understood. He said, oh, okay, so if something happens to me, then we don't have a continuity plan in place to replace me right now. And so there's going to be bad press, and there's going to be an overall negative impact on the company.
So you reframed it. That you reframed that it's not only about you, it's about all this other parts of the business.
It's about all this other stuff that you care
people that
about.
are going to impact it. If we lose you.
Correct.
Yeah, okay, you reframed it. George, you got one?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I probably have way too many. But you can imagine, even for, actually, let me not give you any hints on the client. But what we'll do is together turn it around a little bit and say, what are the security incidents that have happened in the past? How much did that trip and fall lawsuit cost you? What are we talking about now? If we essentially need to get documentation to counter that trip and fall, this is what we're talking about from deploying whatever the necessarily surveillance equipment needs to be versus what you've paid for trip and falls consistently over the years.
And where
So
do you usually get information like that? That will,
it's always got to be in that first vulnerability assessment where you're talking with the stakeholders and you have somebody high enough that has that information.
HR, legal counsel, they're going to have
Absolutely.
this data that
Yeah.
you can amass and say, look at all these numbers.
And
This is
frankly,
costing you.
it's, in a lot of cases, it's even just the security manager. The security managers know what they're paying because it's impacting their budget. They're getting stress surrounding those types of situations, and they want to deal with them. And one of the reasons they're getting stress is because of the financial component of it. So we use those to help justify what we're trying to do.
Wonderful. Thank you for answering those questions. Thank you for your questions. You're going to stick around for the rest of today's summit? You're going to
Most
be
of it.
available
For a little while,
one-on-one conversations? Let's have Dennis Bristol and Jim Mann come up. We want to thank you for your time with us. We have a small gift, a token of our thanks.
Thank you.
Oh, wow.
Well,
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank y'all for
Thank
having
you,
us.
Jim.
And while they're taking the pictures, I should tell you, for those of you who are thinking about the parking passes, those parking passes are going to be delivered to us right at lunchtime. When we break for lunch at 12:30 today, those parking passes will be available where you had gotten your name tags. And then the other thing that I want to mention is the raffle prizes. For those of you that have been with us in the past, or you may have even seen the raffle prize table, we appreciate all the donations from our vendors. Those raffle prizes will be distributed to the winners at 2:30. That will be your incentive to hang out with us. Stick around for the entire lunch period because the entire lunch period is eating and networking and visiting with our vendors. We have a 30-minute break. We will restart here at 10:15.